Uh, so start the recording. Okay, so thank you very much, everyone, for joining us today as part of our adult summer reading program with the theme of Tales and Tales. I reached out to Dr. Helen Scales, and she was nice enough to join us to discuss her background as a marine biologist, but more importantly, her new book. Let me get the copy here. The Brilliant Abyss, and just spend some time with her to learn about the animals, the different animals. So it's a very fascinating book because it's like a whole different world. You get, I mean, you didn't think about it. It's full of mountains. It's full of creatures that have no mouth, no anus, no. I mean, nothing. It just froze your whole perspective in a different way, and it's the wonderful thing about books. So welcome to you, and thank you very much to joining us. I guess I wanted to start with a couple of questions about your background. Did you know as a kid that you were going to be a marine biologist, or did you take a different path to get to that career path?
First of all, thank you so much for that lovely introduction. It's really lovely to be here and talking to you from across the other side of the Atlantic. Yeah, marine biology for me, I guess it was quite a young age. I was always, as a smaller kid, very kind of an outdoorsy, nature-loving type. My family would spend a lot of time in the southwest tip of England, Cornwall. The toe that pokes out into the Atlantic. We would go there most holidays, sort of school breaks, sometimes even at Christmas we would go down there, and it would either be kind of roaming around in the forests there, or we would go to the coast, because there's a beautiful coastline all the way around Cornwall, you know, as it sticks out into the Atlantic. So I guess for me it was normal to have that kind of regular access. I grew up in suburbia, otherwise a long way from the sea, but there was this regular access to the coast that I had as a kid, and I guess it all just sort of crystallized for me as a teenager. I was going to save the world somehow, you know. For a while I think I was going to probably save the rainforests. That was my ambition. It was at a time when, you know, there was a lot of focus on deforestation of the Amazon, that kind of thing. And I think I was pretty set that I was going to go off and work in rainforests. And then I just had this, at that point, it was a little bit of a sidetrack to the bluer parts of the planet rather than the green parts. I guess maybe as this kind of seed had been planted as I was, you know, as a kid on the coasts of Cornwall. But then I basically took a chance, and it was a bit of a chance encounter with scuba diving when I was 15, 16 years old. And a friend and I noticed that our local swimming pool, again in suburbia, nowhere near the ocean, but they were offering tri-dive sessions. So you could go in the swimming pool and have a go on some scuba kit. And we both kind of thought this sounded like fun. And I sort of toyed with the idea of learning to dive. And I thought, well, let's give it a go, shall we? Let's see what this is like. And I loved it. From the first minute I got my head in the water. I mean, even just in a swimming pool, the physical feeling of being underwater and being able to breathe is simply astonishing. It really is extraordinary to be able to do that. So I was hooked immediately on the physical idea of floating in the water and breathing underwater. And so we both signed up for classes, and we then went off, my friend and I. We were training every week in the pool. And then eventually, when it came around to us being ready to go and dive in the outside, out in the wild waters, off we went. It was very cold and fairly uneventful. The first dive I did, I kind of thought this was all a very bad idea because the water was ridiculous. It was nearly freezing. It was so cold, middle of kind of springtime in England. It was very, very cold. But then I saw this one little fish underwater, and I suddenly had this sense of being in the aquarium. Well, the aquarium wall, almost the glass had fallen away, and I was in this space with this like, just fairly normal little fish, but I was in its world. I had this really strong sense of occupying this three-dimensional aquatic realm with it, and wanted to just be there as much as from then on. That was it for me. I wanted to be underwater and diving and learning as much as I could about this hidden world. No one really gets to see this until you put your head beneath the water with a mask on, whether you're snorkeling or diving. You get to see it, and I just was completely hooked at that point. So then from then on, it was sort of studies and research and finding every opportunity I could to travel and explore, and I guess I'm sort of still doing that today as well. So it's gone well. Yeah.
I was listening to a lot of the podcasts, and I really was taken by your description of when you went to the island near Borneo in the South China Sea for the to study the humphead wrasse fish. I loved how you described how it described the whole situation, how it behaved, how it kind of accepted you as you were studying it, and how in the sort of the different behaviors that there are actual there's like a cultural thing, like cows have a matriarchal system, elephants have the matriarchal system, and the humphead wrasse had a patriarchal system. It was neat how you pointed that out.
Yeah, and then a kind of weird version of a patriarchal system in the sense that these big fish, I mean, the big males are going to be like bigger than I can sort of show you on the screen when they're mature. But they were originally females, like they change sex during their lifetime. So so the female stage is the younger stage, and then when they get big enough, they undergo a sex change and they turn into males. It's quite common in various types of fish, especially the wrasse. It has evolved, and it makes sense for the way that they run their populations and how their species reproduce. It works for them. I actually have a picture. Would you like me to show you a picture of this fish?
Yeah.
Do you want to? Shall I share my screen? I wonder if that will. Yeah,
yeah.
let me share.
Let me just. Come on.
I think it's okay. I think it's going to let me do it. I'm just going to put this on. Hang on a second.
All right, sharing screen. All right. So
put that on there. I think this should work. I'm just going to share screen, and I'm going to go to PowerPoint.
Share.
Oh. Hang on a second. I think I was nearly there with sharing mine. Oh, unshare yours and I'll share mine.
Okay, stop share.
Take yours off.
Stop share.
Okay, and then let me just see. I think, hang on, let's see. Let's see if I do that and share. There we go. Is that working? Very good. So actually what I've got here is a cartoon about these fish, but I kind of like this. I found this recently, and this is basically what they look like, this sort of funny big lips and the pattern on their faces, as I've shown in a close-up picture here, which I think is just so beautiful. And this was one of the things I was looking at when I was studying these big fish, was whether or not these patterns, which are, this picture here would have been taken around about here, if you can imagine, on this big fish on the top left, around by its fin. And I was looking to see whether these patterns were like fingerprints and if you could use them to identify individual animals.
Sure.
And I did. That's what I found out. So, and the reason I wanted to do this was because they have these incredible mating aggregation. So one time a month, these huge fish on a coral reef will come to one spot where this one male is like patrolling around, behaving, like kind of a lion on the Serengeti or something. Not the sort of thing you imagine fish do. Like you don't really think of fish as having that sort of dominance, that sort of personality of different animals having, interactions with each other, but they absolutely were. There's one big male who's like the boss of the reef. He's swimming around, and all these younger females will come in and he mates with all of them one by one. That's how it works. But I wanted to know how whether, because this would happen over a number of days, and I wanted to know if it was the same females and the same males, or so there was some kind of other subordinate males would hang around the edges of the mating shoal and try and sneak in, and they would occasionally manage to sneak a mating in when the big guy wasn't looking, or when he was off mating with someone else. There's lots of tricks that go on, but I wanted to know if they were the same animals coming back the day after day after day, and I was using the patterns on their face to show that in fact they were. So it was a kind of a smaller population, if you like, of these animals that were returning frequently to these sites. And then I guess it links into what this cartoon is showing, this that they are under really high threat from overfishing. There's a real demand for them in China for people. They're a status symbol, basically, kind of a high priced fish that people want to spend lots of money on. So there's a great demand for it from fishers. And so what I was looking at was whether these, the way that they spawn, the way they mate in these groups, whether that would increase the risk they have to being overfished. Because if you can imagine, normally there's not many, they aren't very, it's not easy to find an individual fish at most times during the month. You know, they're just mostly they're on their own, they're solitary, but then they have this huge aggregation to mate. And you think, well, if the fishers know where that is, then it's a surefire way for those fish to have lots of them taken away. So that was kind of what I was showing. And indeed, the population I was studying on this tiny island off the coast of Borneo in the middle of the South China Sea, a few years after I was there, sadly, that is essentially what happened. The fishers came in, pretty much all of these animals were taken and traded off for the trade. And it's still a big problem. I mean, there is now a lot more control over the trade, and there's a lot more. From Malaysia, where I was working, for example, there's no legal trade. This has now been, there's been a kind of a ban imposed by the government on trading these very endangered fish. But of course, there's a black trade, there's a black market, and that's continuing. And in fact, using these patterns, these facial patterns, is one way that scientists and managers are trying to kind of track which fish are moving, because these are kept alive, I should say as well. Like, they're not taken and killed initially on the reef. They're actually kept alive and flown, usually, or taken on ships to their restaurants, and they're kept in big tanks, and people can see them swimming around and then pick whichever one they want to eat. So often a restaurant will have a permit for one fish, and they won't really admit to when that fish has been eaten, and they just pop another one in its place, and no one can tell the difference until you know that you can look at their facial patterns, and that will tell you if it's in fact the same fish. So in Hong Kong especially, there's an effort to use people with mobile phones to just take pictures in restaurants and use this kind of app to say which individual fish it was based on these facial patterns, so that we can know if someone's cheating basically and hasn't got the right permits for those particular fish, because it's not what they say it is. So yeah, they are just so beautiful. I mean, some people think their bumped heads is a bit ugly, but I think they're a really beautiful fish.
Oh yeah, they're one of a kind. One of a kind looks like, yeah, exactly. That they would be like fingerprints, the skin indentations and stuff. Amazing.
Yeah.
You talk quite a bit in the book about, jumping ahead to the book, you talk about overfishing, like especially of the orange rothry, quite a bit.
Actually, I don't think I have a picture of orange roughy to show you, but I'm happy to talk about that. Let me check if I've got anything else to show you on the fishing side of things. But I have one picture. I could show you this one actually. If you'd like me to tell you a little more about that.
Well, yeah, touch on it, because it just was, I mean, to fish for it, the present process for fishing for it is takes such an impact on the undersea, and it ruins the stocks.
Yeah,
so
I guess
wow.
So this is a sea mount, which I wanted to show you. It's a map, a kind of a three-dimensional map that's been made with sonar, basically, which is the way in which often that's how really detailed maps of the seabed are made, by ships or by machines underwater, or robots flying around and shooting out beams of sound. So like a whale, basically, and then producing these beautiful three-dimensional maps. And this one is, and that's how we find things like these incredible features on the seabed down in the deep ocean. These enormous, basically volcanoes. Sometimes some of them are dormant, some of them are active, but we have thousands and probably millions of these just colossal mountains down in the deep, several thousand, tens of thousands of feet tall. And most of them that don't actually reach the surface. So finding them is pretty tricky when you can't see where they come up. But there's various ways to try and pick them out. And the reason I've shown you this is that this particular fish that's been heavily hunted in the deep ocean, the orange ruffy, they come to mate around seamounts. So a little bit like the humphead wrasse, that they have these aggregations where at a certain time all of these fish come together, and again it forms a really obvious target, especially because what they're doing is these guys are aggregating on these seamounts, and fishers also have sonar on their ships now, so they can locate seamounts. So it's an obvious big target to go for when you're fishing 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 feet underwater, that kind of thing. And so what happened in the late 80s and early 90s was there was this huge boom in fishing for this particular fish. And I should say, an orange ruffy is, I don't know if you have ever come across it, or even if you've ever eaten it. I've never actually seen it in this sort of supermarket here in the UK, but I gather there was more of a market in the US for this fish.
Yeah, I've heard of it on
it.
sale.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. But these things can live. We've now know. When these fisheries began, it wasn't so clear what the deal was with this particular species. But they can live for 250 years. They are incredibly long-lived, and they don't mature until their 40s. So what was happening, and to add to that, was the fact that they come to these seamounts in huge numbers. And so all the trawlers had to do was send down their nets, find a seamount, figure out where these fish were, send the nets down, and scoop up literally kind of 50 tons of fish at a time in one shot. Sometimes so many fish, the nets would break. They're called ruffy because they have got rough scales, and so their scales would actually abrade the nets, and sometimes these nets would just break and they'd tumble back down, already dead by that point, because they can't really survive that, probably can't survive that journey to the surface and the decompression that involves, and they would tumble back down. It's just incredible waste in terms of that species. And what we saw in the sort of through the early part of the 90s, because there was very little regulation of these fisheries, that a lot of these were coming out of New Zealand, and then various other countries took part as well. They would basically kind of work their way between seamounts. Like they'd fish one out, the catch would decline because they basically took all the fish, and then they'd move on to the next one. And it just was the serial depletion of these incredibly important habitats. So the picture I want to also show you, as well as this one of the seamount, is what grows on seamounts. Aside from these incredibly old and amazing fish that we know very little about, the seamounts are covered in corals and sponges, these incredibly rich ecosystems. Again, you might not think of this, like the corals grow in the deep ocean where there's no sunlight. I didn't really kind of figure this out until not so long ago, that half of the corals that we know of live in the deep ocean. For me, they were the ones I knew about up on coral reefs in the sunlit tropics. But there's around 5,000 species of coral, and at least more than half of those, like 3,000 at least, are in deep, dark waters. And they, again, live for a very long time. So some of these species here live for thousands of years. And the longest lived organism is probably a coral. It has been aged to about 4,200 years. It's a colony, so it's not one individual little coral. They're little polyps which make corals up, these little flower-like sort of anemone things that create these beautiful structures. So you'll see that kind of spiral one on the bottom left-hand corner there. That'll be lots and lots of polyps are making up that structure. So they divide and they kind of grow on that same colony. But the idea that one colony, so certainly I think the top right-hand corner, I think that's a bamboo coral, and they grow for thousands of years. And so that coral has been growing on that spot for thousands of years until a trawling net comes along and scrapes the whole lot away. You can imagine how delicate these things are. Just by looking at them, you can see, and how a big, heavy, these nets are incredibly big and heavy. They would basically just, as we know, smash these corals to pieces, because the fishers as well, when they would first visit a seamount, up would come a whole bunch of coral as well, and this stuff would get dragged up, and they would mostly just pitch it back over the side. Again, that's it, game over for the corals. And some of these are actually precious corals. They've got sort of dense skeletons, like black corals, which can be used to make jewelry and things. And so I think at some point they were like, well, we could keep this maybe, and we could sell it. But again, the coral would quite soon, all of it would be gone, and then the fish would be gone, and then they'd move on to the next seamount. So what we know is that this kind of the damage that this kind of trawling does to these seamounts lasts for decades. Studies have been done going back to ones that we know have been fished, and then comparing them to ones which have never been fished. and there just isn't, there's very, very little sign of good recovery, certainly in the seamounts around New Zealand. Further north in the Pacific near Hawaii, there is some signs that different types of corals are coming back to some of these deep seamounts, which have been fished for roughy and for various other deep species as well. But we're talking on a like decades and decades timescale for any of these ecosystems to come back. I mean that, look at the bottom right-hand corner there, that scene of just so much life. You just wouldn't think that this is thousands of feet underwater, but it's colorful, it's diverse, it's incredibly important stuff down there. And it's being and has, you know, had been obliterated by these fisheries just coming along and just blowing through them basically. Yeah.
Well, they what's I remember a portion in the book where also when you talk about seamounts where the female octopi would go to seamounts and they'd be pretty much laying on their eggs or taking care of their offspring on the seamounts. It's like a great place to have like a hatchery because of all the I guess the supplies and the food that's on there.
Yeah. And that was a real amazing discovery when they found that was on there's a seamount off of California called Davidson Sea Mount. It's one of the biggest ones in US waters. It's huge. And not so long ago, some scientists went down, they sent down a submersible, and a non-occupied one, a remotely operated submersible, and found, a whole bunch of octopuses. And octopuses don't normally hang out together. They're very solitary. They're pretty unfriendly creatures to each other. They tend to just fight and try and eat each other normally. But here in the deep ocean on the seamount, it seems that it was also the warm water was kind of percolating out of the seamount because it is active. There's an active volcano inside. And so it's sort of warming up what's otherwise a pretty cold habitat. And so these octopuses, females, which were brooding their eggs, and probably for quite a long time. We know that deep sea octopuses can breed their eggs. The longest record again was set in California in Monterey Bay. They found a female brooding her eggs for about 4 years, which is much, much longer than octopuses in the shallows. They're much quicker. In fact, most octopuses only live for maybe 1 or 2 years. So to be brooding for 4 years is incredible. But yeah, they found just hundreds of these female octopuses. They wrap their arms around and they kind of keep hold of the eggs before they hatch. All on this seamount. So it's incredibly important habitat for all sorts of species. Octopuses, fish come to feed. Whales, turtles, sharks come to seamounts. It's a very rich ecosystem, and partly because of that physical huge structure is stirring up the seabed and stirring up currents. So there's a lot of plankton for things to feed. So the corals are pulling food from the water. So they're, we know very little about seamounts. There's, as I say, there's thousands, probably millions of them, and very few have actually been visited. Davidson of California is one that we know best because it's fairly accessible, to research institutes along the west coast. But there's so many that are so remote that no one's looked to see what's there. So who knows what we might find when they do eventually go and explore more of these amazing places.
Yeah, it just was amazing. It's I mean, you don't see it, you don't think about it, but there's so much happening in the ocean, like seamounts and now the shells, like I'll have to ask you to describe them better, but the different shells of mountains like moving together or clashing together.
Mm-hmm.
It seems like a very wild, active place.
It is. It absolutely is. I think geologically, the deep ocean, I'm just going to also see if I can find some more pictures to show you. It's a very diverse terrain, if you like, or a seascape that you would get down in the deep ocean. I'll show you this picture here. Of these mountains, of anywhere you get tectonic plates, so those sort of oceanic plates slamming together, you get various different things can happen. You get these tall kind of mountain ranges. Sorry, let me just put this onto the screen for you to see. I've got this map, which is actually the not that, hang on. Here we go. This is the end papers to the hardback cover of the book. This is an illustration by an artist based in California. Again, a guy called Aaron John Gregory is a fantastic nature artist, and he drew this up for me. So this is kind of a picture of what the seabed would look like if you took all the water away from it. And as you can see, I mean, it's hard. I mean, the scale of it is obviously enormous, but there are sort of sea mounts dotted everywhere. I think he's put in, Davidson Sea Mount I was talking about is just there. What we have are these ridges, which I think, Dan, is what you were talking about.
Oh,
so
yeah.
where these plates come together. So you have like basically these huge oceanic plates, tectonic plates. There's a sort of dozen or so of them across the planet, and they're all shifting around. Some are pulling apart where you get eruption of new seafloor, some are smashing together, and it's the ridges generally where the new seafloor is being made. And a lot of that's happening in the Pacific. It's very active. And then as some of them, as they collide together, they will form these enormously deep trenches. So you've got the Mariana Trench is the most famous one, or the Marianas Trench is the deepest of these trenches. And basically it's two plates coming together. One goes under the other, and it just forms this V-shaped chasm. Huge deep chasm. Many of them are more than 30,000 feet deep, especially down this western part of the Pacific. There's a kind of whole chain of them from New Zealand up to Japan, with Marianas in the middle. You've got the Japan Trench, Philippine Trench, the Kermadec Trench. Most of these are under, and the Tonga Trench are under 33,000 feet. And the Marianas goes down to just shy of just under 6 miles. I think it's 11 kilometers. I'd have to do the calculation, but anyway, they're really deep. And what we find is there's life all the way to the bottom of these things. I mean, it was only really 150 years ago that scientists had this idea that life runs out at around about 600 feet, like not that deep at all. Like that's just that life was restricted to the upper part of the ocean, and it was too dark. The Azoic theory, exactly. So it's too dark, it's too much pressure, there's no food down there, how can anything survive? And they thought they had data and evidence to prove that. It turned out actually it was faulty. It was inappropriate sampling equipment. That the way that they were sending down nets wasn't even able to catch the life deeper down for various reasons. And one of the places that this was done was in the Aegean Sea, so over here in Europe. And in fact, the Aegean is a very lifeless part of the ocean. It just happens to have very little food coming in, so there actually isn't much life in the Aegean. But if you'd gone anywhere else, into the Atlantic or into the Pacific, you would have found loads of stuff, as we do now, all the way to the bottom. So there is life in the very deepest trenches. There's no limit to life at all, really. I mean, certain things can't make it any deeper. We think vertebrate life can make it to 8,000 meters roughly. So what's that, like sort of 2,400 feet, something like that. And that below that, fish basically probably can't venture any deeper, but other things can. Jellyfish, octopuses can go down. There's plenty of microbes living at the bottom of these trenches as well. So yeah, I guess, I mean, what I really like about this map is that it just sort of shows you just how different our planet would look if we didn't have this ocean there, and it's very hard to see what's down there. And in fact, there's a project on at the moment. I think it's called Seabed 2030, and the idea is to make a really good map of the whole of the deep ocean by 2030. But even that, it's not that detailed. I mean, it's sort of like one depth measurement for, I think, every few square miles or something. Like, it's really not sort of wouldn't be a map you could go hiking with. Definitely, it's a very coarse scale, but still there's so much that hasn't been fully mapped in the deep ocean, so there's bound to be more surprises as well as we look more and get a better idea of what's actually down there.
Speaking of what's down there, the many we were talking earlier about corals being colorful and the seamounts. A lot of the different fishes, the worms, they use color to communicate.
They do.
Like maybe like a lure, don't come here, or come on here, and then they trap you and have you for lunch.
Yes. Yeah, it's amazing how color and light is really common in the deep ocean. So the animals that make their own light and use this sort of ability to illuminate and make these messages, as you say, to attract things or to repel things, or who else knows what else we have so far not figured out. But it's incredibly common. It's like 75% of animals we know all the way through the deep ocean in the open water have this ability. They're bioluminescent. Here's some on the screen now. I'm showing you. If you see these long wormy things on the left-hand side are gossamer worms, and these are relatives of earthworms, distant relatives of earthworms that we have crawling through the soil on land. And these ones live in the deep ocean. And then long ago, they actually abandoned the seabed and they just swim through the sea. And they're really just exquisite creatures. They spin these pirouettes through the water. And they make light. They make these sort of sparkles, which they'll throw into the water. Probably we think those ones are trying to scare off predators, I should think, kind of startle a place full of sort of light when you're in a dark midnight zone where there's no sunlight. You might think is a good way of really just really upsetting a predator while you have a chance to escape. These ones here, actually, this one on the right hand side, the sort of middle of the right hand side, you might just be able to make out these green dots on the ends of its sort of feet things here, which it uses to swim with. Again, this is a swimming worm, and these are little bombs of light. They'll throw them into the water when they are feeling threatened, and they'll just kind of explode in green light, and then in the meantime this worm has swum away. So it's extraordinary. I mean, I think it's one of those things that no one was really expecting to see animals in the deep ocean with making light and also having really good vision. As a consequence, these two things came together. You find deep sea fish have very, very good vision, not like their equivalents on land in similar dark places, like in caves, like in freshwater caves. You get fish that have lost their eyes or certainly lost their vision. Because there really is no light. But what you find is almost the complete opposite. For fish living in these completely dark parts of the ocean, they actually have incredibly good vision, because what they've evolved to do is see these little fairly dim flashes of light from worms and fish and everything else that makes light. So they have, way better vision than we would. I mean, some of these lights are dim so that a human eye would only really see probably in black and white, because in dim lights we really don't have very good color vision. But these animals have like by far better retinas for detecting very dim lights, and so they can tell the difference between very subtle different shades of greens and blues, which is the normal color, kind of standard color for these bioluminescent lights is blues and greens. So they have like far superior vision than humans. They've evolved specifically to be able to see these animal-made lights in this twinkling world. So again, it's just one of those things, like you think something is impossible and that life couldn't possibly find a way to survive in these crazy conditions, but it does. I think it's one of the lessons that I find from the deep ocean is showing us what life can be beyond anything anyone expected, whether it's making light or having amazingly good eyes or figuring out how to eat food and survive in a place where there's just not much food to go around. So yeah.
Well, I was amazed by your description that the different worms and different creatures at the very bottom of the ocean. It was kind of neat how you delineated between the twilight zone, where like lanternfish are and different animals, and then farther down, it seemed like the worms and kind of creepy, but with some of the descriptions, but just how, say, like the remains of a whale or remains of an alligator, if it happened to flow down all the way down, and the different animals and different creatures that took advantage of it.
Would you like me to? I have some pictures of that. Would you like me to show you?
Sure.
Let's see. Oh, that's a close-up of those beautiful worms I was just explaining to you. But I'm going to scroll through. Oop, is it going to go? Oh, there we go. I should have shown you this one. There you go. That's showing you the green lights on this one they call the bomber worm. But I'm going to scroll ahead. You've had to see. I want to show you. This is the. I'm going to jump ahead and show you. This is the whale that was first discovered to be eaten by all these different animals. So this was a whale found in California, in Monterey Bay. So it's the Monterey Bay Monterey Bay Aquarium Research Institute, MBARI, have done so much work in the deep ocean, and they were the first to find a whale fall. So this is the idea that a big dead whale whales that die will sink down into the deep ocean and bring with them a huge amount of food. The deep ocean hasn't got much going for it in terms of food, so a big whale is not going to be left alone. And I think you can just make out in this picture that these little pink things walking around are sea cucumbers. They're actually nicknamed sea pigs because they do look like little pink pigs with little legs, and they walk around on the seabed and they scavenge. And then the really cool stuff, which, well, at least I think is pretty cool, is this red fuzzy stuff on the skeleton. And actually these are bone-eating worms, the Osedax worms. This is a close-up here on the left-hand side. And these have evolved, again, they're worms, relatives of earthworms, but they've evolved specifically to eat the bones of dead vertebrates. So as they land down in the deep ocean, and scavengers will eat the rest of the carcass, it'll leave the bones. And these animals have figured out how they use acid to etch into the bones. They have this weird kind of green root structure which absorbs food from the bones. And there's loads of different species. We actually found one, so that I zipped past it, but I'll show you those pictures from beforehand. Go back to the beginning of that story. I talk in the book about this trip I did in the Gulf of Mexico on board a research vessel, Pelican, coming out. It's the Louisiana University's Marine Consortium based just south of New Orleans, which was where I was working. And we went out to sea for 2 weeks in some pretty rough conditions in the Gulf in February. But what we did, we were interested in what happens to wood when it falls into the deep ocean, because that is also a source of food. You might be pretty weird, basically, to think about the fact that trees, and they do sometimes fall over, they'll die and maybe get swept out to sea, or logs and branches will sink down into the deep ocean. And actually that's food that some animals have also specialized in eating. So there is a whole ecosystem that's entirely based around wood in the deep ocean. So we were studying that, but we also looked at what might happen to an alligator, because alligators are also pretty common in the southern coast of the United States now, and they're doing much better than they were. They were in quite some trouble, but actually conservation programs have meant that numbers are pretty high now. So we took some animals which were obtained by permit from a humane culling program, and we took them down and we lowered them down into the deep ocean using a submersible. So this is some of the kit the deep sea scientists use. This is an ROV, the remotely operated underwater vehicle. I kind of just call them submersibles normally, but they're like a deep diving robot. No humans are on board these ones. They're all controlled from the surface along a great big cable. And they have amazing cameras, these arms, you can see the kind of robotic arms to pick things up and put things down. And we would launch this in the morning, and it would sink down to 6,000 feet thereabouts to the seabed and do our science down there underneath. And we're controlling it with the cameras and everything from the surface. That's how we're doing our work with the wood, but we were also putting down alligators. And this is just a picture of what happened after 24 hours to one of them. Those pink things are called giant isopods. They're about the size of a football, and they're relatives of pill bugs, the little tiny guys that you would get in a garden, or if you look under a plant pot you'd see them, and the ones that roll up into a little ball when they're scared. These are deep sea equivalents, and they're huge. And it sort of shows one thing that you get in the deep ocean, which is not only do things tend to live for a very long time, but they can be really big in comparison to perhaps in other places. And these are basically, it's like a camel's hump. Their big body is full of fat. These are scavengers, and they don't have to eat. They eat like once every 4 years or so, when something like an alligator comes along, and they'll come and feast. Some of them so much, like one of these animals was kind of stupid. It ate so much it just swam off and like went headfirst into the seabed. It kind of stupefied itself. It eaten so much, and it would presumably then just go crawl away and find somewhere to sit for a couple of years until another bunch of food comes down. So they adapted to this sort of a life where food is very dispersed and not very common, and so you make do with what you can find. But it's just we had no idea this was going to happen. Actually, no one had done this alligator thing before. People have been doing whales and other animals and putting them in the sea and deep sea and seeing what eats them. But we were the first to do alligators, and the first to do it in the Gulf of Mexico. And not only did we find this cool scene of the isopods, but we found later on, we went back and there was another alligator had been stripped back about a month later to a skeleton, and we took a sample of that and found 2 new species of these crazy bone-eating worms. So yeah, that's the giant isopod. And so yeah, we had 2 new worm species. So it was pretty fun. It was pretty crazy, so it's pretty creepy, but again, it's this amazing adaptations of life in an extreme way, and just unexpected things happen in the deep ocean all the time.
Yeah, the fact that some of the worms, I think you described one as basically a sack.
The sock, yeah, the sock one as well. There's the purple sock creatures.
Yeah, that how
Yeah.
they may, okay, they may not have a mouth, may have
Hmm.
anus or traditional things, but yet they're able to survive and propagate.
Yeah.
Uh, that I think the one worm had male larvae inside of them.
Oh, that's the bone-eating worms. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
So these crazy things as well that eat the worm, the bones. The sort of the ones you can see in the first species were found to be a couple of an inch or so long. Some of them since then have been found are much smaller, but these inch-long ones. And it's just that those are just the females, and for a long time they couldn't find any males until it turned out that the males were inside her. So they live in these little tubes, and they have these feathery tentacles that stick out one end, and that's to absorb oxygen from the water, and then the roots push into the bone to eat. And then the males, basically, when they hatch, they just stay as tiny little things, and they sit inside the tube. And basically, when she produces eggs, they just immediately fertilize them. They never leave her body. It's a very strange way, but if you think about it, I mean, in the deep ocean, it's pretty hard to find a mate. It's very big space, three-dimensional, huge space. So it makes sense if you find a mate to stick with them, and that's exactly what these males do. Is they literally, again, it sort of actually chimes back a bit to the humphead wrasse story. That we think that what happens with these bone-eating worms is that they also change sex, or they hold their sex in kind of in suspended animation, if you like. When they're larvae, we think they're drifting through, probably these little larvae that are tiny things, are drifting through the deep ocean, and they haven't yet decided what sex they're going to be until they land on a bone. And if they get there first on a bare piece of bone that's just been stripped back of an alligator or a whale or whatever it is, then they'll turn into a female and grow into this bigger worm with the root and the feathers and everything, the gills. If they land secondly, so if they actually land on a worm, so if there's a bone that's already colonized, and if a larva comes along and lands on a worm, then they become a male, because they basically like, oh well, there's no space for any more big worms, I'm gonna have to be the small one. So then he crawls into the tube and turns into a male. So they kind of keep their sex sort of pending until they figure out where they are and what they can do, because they literally, I mean, a bone, just if it was full of females, then there's no more space for any more females. So it makes sense for the latecomers to be the males. So that's how it works, and it does work. It's just kind of strange.
well, yeah. You also talk in the book about how these kinds of those kind of cells and things that may have been the first place where life started.
Yeah.
That kind of willingness to adapt to the situation.
It's a pretty cool thing. There's lots of different pieces of evidence that we have that we're pulling out of the deep ocean that suggest this could be where life first began, where sort of the first earliest, very basic living cells assembled themselves. And we don't know for sure, and I don't know if we'll ever really know for sure how life started on this planet. Whether it started on any other planets as well is another big question. But certainly there are clues to very early forms of life coming from bugs and microbes that we're finding in deep sea sediments, and their sort of genes are showing kind of ideas of these could be from a very early lineage. And there's also ideas that hydrothermal vents could be where life first began. These incredible black smokers. I think I might have a picture of one of those actually.
Oh yeah, I was thinking, I should ask about hydrothermal vents.
Well, you should, because they're awesome. Let me just I think what I've got here is, well, I've got a picture of one with a particular animal that lives on them, which is one of my favorites, which I also write about in the book, which is the Yeti Crabs. So here is, on the left hand side, this is a piece of a chimney, so you can just sort of see hopefully that this has got black, sort of, it looks like sort of smoke coming out of it, but this boiling hot liquid coming out of fluids coming out of the deep sea. So hydrothermal vents form at these points where these tectonic plates I was mentioning earlier, where they pull apart, and you've got seawater will kind of seep down into the seabed and get heated up on these shallow chambers of volcanic rock, and then come scorching and gushing back up to the seabed surface, and then they erupt in these springs. It's like a deep water spring, basically, equivalent to a kind of a geyser on land, only much, much hotter, because there's so much pressure that the water doesn't actually boil. So you can get liquids that are at hundreds of degrees. and they're full of toxins, and there's not much oxygen, and it's very acidic, and it's just not a very nice place to be. And yet when we look at them, they are, well, when they were discovered, they were originally discovered in 1977. And since then lots more have been studied, but basically they're full of life. They're these amazing oases of life, including things like these crabs, these funny white crabs, which, as you can see, are in enormous abundance on these hydrothermal vents. So, and then subsequently it was discovered that what's going on is the basis of these ecosystems is a completely different way of living compared to us out here on land. So here we are on this lovely sunny sunny surface planet, walking around on land with the sun pouring down, feeding the plants that are basically putting energy into the food web for all of us. So ultimately we're all plant-based, and it's all based on the ability of those plants to harness energy from the sunlight to get carbon dioxide into their bodies and create sugars, and then basically we eat the plants, or we eat the things that eat the plants. And that's pretty much what we thought biology and life on Earth was all about, until these vents were discovered. And this is, it basically turned out there's a whole other way of doing life, and that is not photosynthesis, which is this sun-based energy production, but chemosynthesis. So it's a kind of dark alternative to photosynthesis, and it takes place in the complete dark. And it's actually bacteria mostly is the basis of this. So not plant life, but bacteria that, instead of using sunlight, use chemical energy to produce sugars. And so, so I'll just quickly say that this Yeti crab here has got these bacteria growing on this sort of hairy chest on its front, and then they eat that bacteria, and that's how they survive.
Yeah, that's what I was going to mention. How they're essentially grow their own food on themselves.
They do, exactly, yeah. So these ones grow them on the outside. The crabs have these hairy. There's also Yeti crabs, as I said, in brackets. So the Yeti crabs, there's several different species. This one, it's called the Hoff crab after David Hasselhoff. That was just a nickname because of the hairy chest thing. That's not their official name, but that's what the scientists kind of have fun with. But the Yeti crabs are their sort of their cousins, and they have long hairy arms, and they have their bacteria in their arms, and that's how they feed themselves. So a lot of other animals actually have these living inside them. So this one is another animal from a hydrothermal vent, one of my favorites, the scaly foot snail. And these guys have shells made of iron and these weird feet covered in scales, which is unlike any other snail you'd find anywhere on the planet. And they have bacteria living inside them, so that it's like a symbiosis. Basically, they have these special pouches they've evolved in their stomach where these bacteria live, and then that's how they live together in harmony. Basically, the snail makes sure that it's in the right place on a nice vent with all these chemicals coming out, so they can feed the bacteria, and the bacteria are nice and safe inside their snail, so they both get along quite nicely, and that's how they survive. So there's all of life on vents is basically this weird balance of kind of chemical energy coming out of these stunning. I mean, some of these black smoke, we call them black smokers, these tall chimneys, because they look like there's smoke coming out, even though it's not really smoke. And they can be tens of feet, hundreds of feet tall. There was one called Godzilla. I forget exactly. I think it was about 100 feet tall, that one. It did eventually topple over, and these are quite active areas of the deep sea. So, things do change. But that was off the coast of Oregon. There's a whole area of venting, hydrothermal vents just up there, and some incredible and pretty well studied, because it's fairly accessible compared to some of these places, and so we know a fairly good amount about what lives there. And giant 6-foot tube worms and clams the size of dinner plates and Yeti crabs, all sorts of crazy things live on hydrothermal vents. Yeah.
And talking about microbes and biology, you also talk about in the book about possible future medicines that can be found in the bottom of the ocean.
Yeah. So this is one reason I kind of went through various, as we've already touched on, kind of the issues and the threats that the deep ocean is facing, like fishing, but also why the deep ocean matters. It really does matter, even though it's, some place that most people will never think about, let alone get to go there. But actually, there's lots of reasons why the deep ocean is incredibly important for all of life on Earth. Some of it comes down to the fact that lots of heat gets absorbed into the deep ocean, and so therefore climate change is much less than it would be otherwise. We really would be struggling at this point if it wasn't for the oceans. But also there's sort of practical things that we can gain from the deep, and one of them is potentially medicines. And this picture I'm showing you here is of a deep sea sponge, and actually quite a while ago. This is so far the only deep sea drug that's based on an animal that came from the deep ocean. But I think that's really going to change soon as we're doing more of this kind of research. But this was based on a discovery, I think, in the 1980s. And scientists basically found this weird molecule, this weird complex molecule. I put on the chemistry of it on the screen there, called halochondria. And they found this chemical and they showed that it was incredibly powerful as an anti-cancer agent. And it went through lots of development. I mean, these things are kind of just ideas that we get from animals, taking samples of these things and then sort of analyzing them in the lab and figuring out what the chemistry is. And what came out of that was this drug called eribulin, which is used for a late stage metastatic breast cancer treatment. So that is available and people are using that. So it's actually saving lives, which is wonderful. But what we're seeing now is a lot of research going into like looking for more of these ideas from the deep ocean. And it turns out there is just this whole treasure trove of chemicals and chemistry in things like the corals that grow on sea mounts and the sponges. This is a sponge. There's lots of sponges that are full of weird chemistry, weird toxic chemicals. There are also lots of microbes and bacteria which make their own medicine, their own toxic chemicals. So what's happening now is people are going down with things like these remotely operated submersibles, and they can take really small samples of tissue, like just a small little snippet with those robotic arms, and they can take that back to a lab. And that's enough to amplify the chemicals and to figure out what they are. So it's really just kind of looking for ideas, sort of chemical ideas, if you like, from the deep ocean. But to be able to do that, we need to have those habitats. We need to keep them intact and healthy, and we shouldn't be trawling them just for these, the one-shot hit of taking some fish from them, or potentially mining them. This is another big threat to the deep ocean, is the possibility that could happen within the next few years that we could start seeing mining companies trying to extract metals from hydrothermal vents, from the deep sea mounts. They have these metal-rich rocks on the surface, which people want to exploit, and from other places too. But if we want to have things like benefits of potentially new medicines, we really need to look after these really delicate ecosystems and keep them intact as much as we can, for our own sakes and for whatever else we might discover from these incredibly diverse and so much we still don't know about what lives in these deep places. You go and you find not only the odd bone-eating worm, but just so many new species and ecosystems that we just didn't know about before. So the possibilities really do seem to be pretty abundant for finding exciting things and potentially really useful things in the deep ocean.
Yeah, I was disappointed to see how the island nation of Nauru is kind of pushing the ISA to say, hey, let's get deep sea mining going.
Yeah,
it's bummed by that.
It's pretty shocking, really. I mean, so the idea of mining the deep seabed has been around for decades now. Again, it was something that was first thought about in the sort of 60s and 70s, really. But technologies back then weren't really good enough for it to be a feasible thing. Whereas now, that's it's getting to be more likely that this could technically happen. The question is whether we should, and we do have this organization, the ISA you mentioned, the International Seabed Authority, whose job they exist to look after the deep seabed out in the high seas. So everywhere that isn't owned by a country, so beyond our national boundaries, there's this huge swathe of the planet. Half of the planet is basically it doesn't belong to anybody, and it's shared but amongst all of us. Actually, we are kind of, all of humanity now and in the future are joint kind of owners, really, of the deep seabed. And the ISA exists to see, for in all of our best interests, to look after the seabed. But unfortunately, the way it's going is it's looking like they're taking very seriously really one part of their remit, which is to exploit the sea riches of the seabed and to set up mines, which is only half the deal. They really should be looking after it as well. And basically what's happened just in the last few weeks is that one of the many countries want to start mining in various parts of the deep ocean. So most of them either working with state-based corporations, or in the case of Nauru, this tiny island in the middle of the Pacific, is working with a Canadian-based company called the Deep Green. It's about to change its name to the Metals Company. And they've been involved in mining for years in various different guises. Not that mining has happened yet, but in trying to get the first mines open. And they have basically triggered a weird little loophole in the legislation, which means that if they if they say they want to start mining in 2 years' time, then they kind of will be allowed to. But it's all very vague, and it's causing a lot of concern and consternation amongst the other nations who either don't want to mine, because a lot of countries don't want this to happen, or ones who do want to mine, but they want to do it on their own timescale and not to have the whole thing rushed. So it's kind of a bit chaotic at the moment. I mean, time will tell how this all goes down. There's a possibility that actually they'll be legally challenged and that this won't even go ahead. But it is very worrying. And I'm myself and hundreds of other scientists and policy experts have recently signed a deep sea science statement saying that what we think needs to happen is not mining, certainly not in 2 years' time, but a moratorium, a pause in this industry while science takes place. And what we need to know is much, much more about what is in the deep ocean and what is at risk, basically, if these mines should open, these enormous new industry, which would be completely unprecedented on Earth in terms of the footprint that it would have, the impacts it would have on life, and these really important processes like carbon being stored in the seabed, that kind of thing. We're messing with stuff that we have a sense that it's likely to have a huge impact, but we don't know fully yet how bad. And now is not the time to rush ahead and say, we're going to do this in 2 years no matter what. And I would say, I mean, Nauru is working very closely with this corporation who have very strong intentions of pushing this industry into existence. So exactly what's happening and why they did this is pretty fishy, I would say. And
Yeah,
I hope the truth will come out at some point as to exactly what is happening and why there, and why this 2 year thing. It's all very strange.
yeah, just you you sort of read the past history and read the current press about it, and you're like question mark, like
Yeah.
it's like
Yeah.
But well, I just want to touch base with a couple more questions. Uh, what about you? Tell us about your work with your sea changers
Oh, cool. Yeah.
organization.
Absolutely. I mean, this is a British-based charity, but the nice thing about it is it's quite a small-scale thing. So basically, it's run by a couple of women who are really keen divers and who wanted to do something to help the seas specifically around Britain. And what they figured out was that they weren't the only ones. You know, a lot of people love the ocean and love being there, or love, being connected to it, but wanted a way to try and help. And so they go and basically have donations made by various different kind of companies, so diving companies, cruises, people who go to sea and spend time at sea. And then they have that the option at the end when you're buying things to kind of do you want to donate a bit more to this charity. So that's how they raise their money, it's through ocean lovers in various ways, people who enjoy the ocean and who want to donate. And then I come in and I help basically decide how that money is then handed out. And we give fairly small grants to many grassroots organizations who are doing ocean science and ocean conservation. So it's a lot of, how to clean things up, how to figure out pollution, how to understand more about the ocean. A lot of it's citizen science projects, so getting lots of people involved. So it's a really nice model of kind of how the money is raised and also how we spend it. And it's projects which, a few £100, maybe £1,000 at most, really makes a difference. And it gives them the money they need to do sort of what they want to do. So it's been running for 10 years now, and it's a really wonderful thing. It's a lot of very, very passionate people all working voluntarily to make this happen. So I just play a small part into sort of mainly on the science side, deciding which I think are the best projects to be funding. So we get grants about 3 times a year. So it's all open for application. So if you know anyone in Britain who wants to do marine conservation, we are only based in the UK at the moment, but I'm always happy to get applications from people working over here. So.
Oh yeah, it's very worthy cause. And finally, what would you recommend for anybody in the world? What can you do to take care of your oceans, or like here in Michigan, the Great Lakes, or what can you do to be an advocate?
It's a very good question. And also I should say, it's interesting to think about how to make those connections for people who don't live on the ocean, or, who haven't got that immediate. It's more obvious for people who are, in coastal states or have that, have it on their doorstep. But for those of us who don't, and I, for much of the year in the UK here, I don't live by the coast, but we have got many connections through. And, there's all sorts of things we can do. I mean, if you eat seafood, then you've got that direct connection to the aquatic world, whether it's freshwater or the oceans, depending on what you eat. and you can make good choices in terms of what you want to eat, and be interested in finding out where these animals came from, how they were caught. In the US, there's a really good way of finding out that is through, again, the Monterey Bay Aquarium have, I think, a good fish guide or something like that. So search for that. I
Okay.
think they have an app. And again, and they do the hard work of figuring out which are the better choices, because it's pretty complicated in terms of figuring out what's a better fish to eat versus other ones. I mean, obviously things like orange roughy are that's a no-brainer, but there's a lot of more kind of subtle things going on. So check them out. They're great. They'll give you, I think, a fairly simple system of like good, bad, okay for different types of fish. Then there's things like, well, I mean, there's plastic pollution is an obvious one as well. Trying as individuals to think carefully about single-use plastics. Obviously recycling is an important part of that, but you know, I certainly in my kind of day-to-day life try and do whatever I can to cut down really unnecessary single-use plastics, because you just never know where it's going to end up. We have awful things over here in Europe of knowing that even stuff we put in our recycling may not even get properly recycled, and it's all a bit, you know, getting sent overseas, and it's not clear what's happening to those plastics. So trying to really reduce unnecessary plastics and finding sustainable alternatives is really important. And then I guess I would finally say that we all have a voice, and we all have a vote. We all have a right to demand of our elected officials to do the best things for us and for society, for the environment. And, you know, saving the oceans is about saving the planet. It's not, there's no boundaries with it. Saving the deep ocean is about looking after the shallow seas too. If we could sustainably fish the surface seas, we wouldn't need to be trying to get things like orange roughy from deeper down. If we could figure out mining on land so that it was more ethical and cleaner, I think that would be the best option, not to go down mining in the deep ocean. So we have got that ability to get involved and say what we want, and demand that of those people who are representatives, and have those conversations about what we aren't going to accept mining, for example, that kind of thing. Support organizations. There's a thing called the Deep Sea Conservation Coalition. They are doing great work. There's a for saving the deep ocean, there's a project called the Oxygen Project. They're doing fantastic work in terms of the deep ocean and lots of other issues too. So find there's people as well, there's NGOs, there's charities who are pushing for healthier seas, and educate yourself and learn and be interested, talk to people. I think that's very powerful too. It's why I write my books. I want people to be interested and to know, and to pass those stories on to each other, and show that this is a place that we can all care about, even if we don't get to go there, and that's the case very much for the deep ocean, but elsewhere as well. So yeah.
Oh, thank you very much. I'd be glad to talk with you on this subject for much longer time, because your passion, your knowledge is very, very, it's great. It's like you're really open things up and said, wow, there's this great world under the sea. So wanted to ask everyone attending, do you have a quick question? You can either unmute yourself or use the chat feature at the bottom. Feel free to ask a question if you'd like.
I do have one question. Hello.
Hi.
Yeah.
First of all,
go ahead, Patty.
This was very interesting. We just enjoyed this so much. But what advice would you give a younger person, maybe a college age student trying to go into the field?
Okay, so I mean, I really think now is an exciting time for marine science in general, and especially for deep ocean science as well. If you're thinking specifically about the deep, it's a fairly small field, so, and I think it's growing. So if that is something of particular interest, if that region, I mean, I think I didn't actually originally train as a deep sea scientist, but I think if I went back now, that's what I would do. I'd probably be like an engineer developing these amazing robots. I mean, the technologies are just incredible. So I would say, I mean, if it is the deep specifically that you're keen to find more about, look for institutions which have a strong presence in deep ocean. And there are people scattered around in various different places, individual researchers who have a mind, you know, are interested in these more extreme parts of the ocean. And a lot of them are, certainly the biologists are really a wonderful community who are very supportive of anyone who wants to make it into that field. And there are very cool ways in which to do that as well. And what you want to basically get yourself on a research cruise, which is an opportunity that's often open up even to undergraduates. I was supposed to be on a research cruise just a couple of weeks ago, but I couldn't make it because of the pandemic. Sadly, that was going to be out of Scripps Institution, and that I know that particular trip had a whole range of everyone from undergraduates to, you know, to professors were on board. And that's basically when you get to go to sea. I call it a cruise. It's not, you know, there's no cocktails. There's not even any alcohol involved. Certainly on American ships. But basically you go to sea for days, weeks, sometimes even months at a time. And that's when a lot of the deep sea hands-on science happens. And it's where a lot of people learn and really get the ropes of what this is all about. So that's an incredible opportunity. And those opportunities are out there. But it involves finding those individuals. So search around online for people who are working and publishing on deep sea topics and talk to them. I mean, everyone is, you know, it's such a growing field that what they want is just really smart, tuned in people. So find those people, you know, educate yourself, read and learn yourself, and see what can happen. But I do think it's an exciting time. I think it's a good time for this kind of growing interest and growing kind of focus on the deep ocean. Yeah. I hope that
Great.
helps.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, and follow. If there's a passion for it, just follow it, and don't ignore if anyone tells you it's difficult and there's not many jobs. Nothing is easy, and especially the good stuff in life is not easy. So
yeah.
So any other questions from our attendees?
Oh, there's a note in the chat there about the Natural History Museum in New York. You're absolutely right. There's some folks there. Smithsonian have got some fantastic deep sea scientists. I mean, I was at LUMCON, Louisiana University's Marine Consortium. So that's a whole kind of network around the southern Louisiana. There's obviously Scripps, there's Mbari, there's the Monterey Bay. I mean, go to the aquarium, go and talk to those guys. There's a new deep sea exhibition actually opening in the Monterey Bay Aquarium at the moment, which I think is going to be absolutely amazing. There's tons of stuff out there. So yeah. Okay. Well, thank you very much, Helen. It was great talking with you. It's a fabulous book. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
I encourage people to get a hold of it, whether through the library or a purchase on their own, available at Literati Bookstore and many bookstores around our state. So thank you very much, Helen, and have a good evening.
Thank you so much. Thank you all so much. It's lovely to speak to you all, and thank you for your support. And I'm really glad you liked the book. And if you want to hear me talking more, I do the audiobook too. So I don't know if you rent out audiobooks at the library, but I did. It's coming out next week, I think, and that was me sitting in this very room because everything had to be done at home. But I narrated the audiobook for this first time. I haven't done it before.
Oh,
so that's
a great podcast on your website.
Yes, there's some on there too. So thank
Have
you
a good
so
night.
much. Yeah, take care. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks. Bye-bye.